Abigail Mercer did not cry when the stagecoach rolled away and left her standing alone in the Texas dust. She had already used up every tear she owned burying her father in a town that never once said his name right. What she had left was one canvas bag, a rifle, and an advertisement folded so many times the crease had gone white. She read it one last time. Ranch wife needed. Dairy work. Room board wage negotiable. She folded it back up and put it in her pocket. She was done being negotiable. If this woman's story already has your heart beating faster, hit that subscribe button right now and follow every single part to the end, and drop your city in the comments below because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The stagecoach driver had warned her. Hartwell Place. He'd said it the way a man says the name of something already dead. You sure miss that road ain't been graded in 2 seasons. I'm sure, Abigail said. He didn't argue. He just flicked the reins and didn't look back at her when she stepped down. That was how Abigail Mercer arrived at the edge of Caleb Hartwell's property on a Tuesday morning in July of 1888, with the Texas sun already punishing and the air tasting like chalk. She stood at the property line for a moment and took it all in. Not the way a woman looks at a new home, but the way a woman looks at a wound and tries to figure out how deep it goes. The first thing she noticed was the south fence. Not broken. Cut. Clean lines, deliberate spacing. Someone had taken a tool to it on purpose. The second thing she noticed was the silence. A working cattle ranch is never quiet. There should have been lowing the shuffle of hooves, the bang of the barn door in the morning wind. What she heard instead was almost nothing. A single crow. The creak of something loose. The distant sound of a well chain that hadn't been pulled in too long. She picked up her bag and walked toward the house. Caleb Hartwell was standing in the yard when she came through the gate. He was 34 years old and looked 50. Not from stupidity, from carrying. He had dark brown hair going rough at the edges, a jaw that hadn't seen a proper shave in a week, and the kind of sunburn that came from working outdoors every day without a single break to think about yourself. He had his hat in his hands, which meant he'd seen her coming, and had reached for the gesture of welcome, even when he clearly didn't feel it. Miss Mercer, he said. Mr. Hartwell. She looked at him and then passed him toward the barn. You want to tell me about your south fence, or should I just go have a look myself? He blinked. The fence. It's cut, not broken. Cut. That's a different problem. He put his hat back on. The ad said dairy work. I can read an ad, she said. I can also read land. Which one do you need more right now? He didn't answer. That was answer enough. She asked to see the milk cow first. He led her to the barn without speaking, which she didn't mind. Men who filled silence with noise when they were ashamed tended to lie in that noise, and she didn't need his lies. She needed his ledger. The milk cow was in bad condition. Swollen, restless, too warm. Abigail set down her bag and went to work without being asked, without explaining herself, without looking at Caleb for permission. She had milked cows since she was 9 years old, and she milked this one with the same steady hands, same quiet efficiency, same complete lack of ceremony. Caleb stood in the barn doorway and watched her. You've done this before, he said. I've done most things before, she said. Hand me that cloth. He handed it to her. How long has she been like this? A few days. He paused. Maybe a week. Who's been tending her? Me, when I can. She looked up at him, not with judgment, with the flat, clear look of a woman who was filing away a fact. What's taking you away from the cow? Other things. Debt, she said. He went quiet. Mr. Hartwell, she said, turning back to the cow. I'm not here to make you feel better about your situation. I'm here because the advertisement said there was work to be done and I needed the work. But I can't do my job if you won't talk to me plainly. So, is it debt? A long silence. Yes. How much? Another silence. Longer. More than the cattle can cover? Who holds the note? Man named Crow. Elias Crow. He's a cattle buyer out of... I know who Elias Crow is, she said. That stopped him. He looked at her differently for the first time. You do? My father moved cattle in this region for 12 years, she said. Crow's name came up. It always came up. She stood, wiped her hands, looked at him directly. The kind of way a name comes up when a man's been following trouble for a living. Caleb stared at her. Your father was a cattleman. Was, she said. The single word carried the whole story, and she didn't offer more of it. I want to see your account book after supper. And I want to walk the perimeter fence before dark. Is that going to be a problem? He looked at her for a long moment. No, ma'am, he said. That ain't gonna be a problem. Supper that night was beans and salt pork, and a silence that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Abigail ate without complaint, without performance. She'd eaten worse, and she didn't see the value in pretending she hadn't. Caleb's ranch hand, a thin, weather-burned boy of about 18 named Denny, kept sneaking glances at her from across the table like she'd arrived from some other country. She had questions she didn't ask yet. Where were the rest of the hands? Why was a 34-year-old man running a cattle operation with one teenager? What had happened in the last year that reduced the workforce to 2 people and a sick cow? She saved those questions. There would be time. She didn't get the time she expected. They were still at the table. Caleb's coffee going cold when the sound of horses came up the road. Not one horse, several. Moving fast and then pulling up short at the gate with the specific, practiced arrogance of men who expected the gate to open for them. Denny looked at Caleb. Caleb went very still. That Crow's men? Abigail asked. Stay inside, Caleb said, already standing. I don't take orders about where I stand, she said, standing as well. He looked at her with something that might have been frustration or might have been the beginning of something else. Either way, he didn't argue. He walked out the front door, and she followed him 3 steps behind. There were 4 of them. Big men on big horses, the kind of men hired for their size and their willingness not to ask questions. The one in front had a leather satchel across his saddle and the flat professional expression of a man delivering something unpleasant on behalf of someone else. Hartwell, the man said. He didn't tip his hat. He didn't look at Abigail. He pulled a folded document from the satchel and held it out. Mr. Crow sends his regards. Final offer. You sign this by Sunday, you walk away with enough to start clean somewhere else. You don't sign. He shrugged, a slow and deliberate performance. The bank holds the auction on Monday. Your cattle, your land, your tools, all of it. Caleb took the paper. He didn't open it. He stood there holding it like it was something that might burn him, which Abigail supposed it was. That's generous of Mr. Crow, Caleb said. His voice was very flat, very controlled, and entirely unconvincing. He's a generous man, the writer said. Abigail stepped forward. Not dramatically. Not with any gesture. She simply moved to stand at Caleb's left shoulder close enough that her presence had to be acknowledged. The writer looked at her for the first time. And who's this? Someone who lives here, she said. He smiled at that, a slow, contemptuous thing. The dairy girl. The dairy girl, she agreed, her voice perfectly calm. Who would like to know the specific section of the debt agreement Mr. Crow is citing as justification for Sunday's deadline? Because I've read several of Crow's standard contract terms, and I've never seen a forced sale clause that short. The writer's smile did not disappear, but it changed. Something behind it recalibrated. Sign by Sunday, he said to Caleb, ignoring her. Mr. Crow doesn't like to wait. They rode out. Caleb stood in the yard with the paper in his hand and didn't move for a moment. Then he turned and looked at her, and what was on his face was something complicated, humiliation and confusion and the very first edge of something that wasn't quite hope, but wasn't quite despair either. You know contract law, he said. I know enough to ask the right question, she said, which is different from knowing the answer. Now let me see that document. He handed it to her. She read it standing in the yard in the last of the daylight, while Denny hovered nervously behind them. When she finished, she read it again. Then she folded it and held it at her side, and was quiet for a moment. What? Caleb said. This place isn't failing on its own, she said. Someone is making sure it fails. He stared at her. The deadline in this document doesn't match the original loan terms your father recorded, she said. Someone changed those terms, Mr. Hartwell. And whoever changed them did it without you noticing, which means either you trusted Crow without reading carefully, or someone altered records after the fact. That's... He stopped. That's a serious accusation. Yes, she said. And I might be wrong. So tomorrow morning, before I do anything else, I want to see every piece of paper connected to this ranch. Every bill of sale, every breeding record, every debt note. All of it. Why? She looked at him steadily. Because no man should sign away land before he knows what was stolen from it. He was quiet. The night settled around them heavy and hot, the way Texas July nights do, pressing down like something that doesn't intend to lift. All right, he finally said. I'll pull the papers. She was up before the sun. Denny found her at the barn before he'd even gotten his boots properly on, already working. She'd rechecked the cow, assessed the feed situation, confirmed what she'd suspected about the water trough. The pipe feeding it from the North Creek had been deliberately diverted, which explained why the animals were stressed, and the cow had been struggling. Who'd do that? Denny said, staring at the diverted pipe. Someone who needed the livestock to look sick and neglected, she said. Someone who wanted a reason to call this place a failing operation. Denny chewed on that. Crow. She didn't answer, which was its own answer. She spent the first 3 hours of the morning doing what the advertisement had promised. Milking, feeding, assessing the dairy situation with practical, competent hands. And in every task, she was watching. She was counting. She was measuring the gap between what the ranch record said and what the ranch actually contained. By the time Caleb came out of the house with his coffee and his sheepish, uncertain expression, the expression of a man who wasn't sure if last night had been a dream or a threat, she had already written 3 pages of notes in the small leather book she kept in her dress pocket. How many head did your father run at peak? She asked, without greeting him first. He blinked. 60, maybe 65. And you? Started at 42 when I took over. Down to 30 now after last year's drought sales. She flipped open her notebook. Denny counted 23 head in the south pasture yesterday. Where are the other 7? Caleb set his coffee down, very slowly, the way a man does when something just confirmed a fear he hadn't let himself name yet. I was told, he said carefully, that I sold 6 head in April, emergency debt payment to Crow. Were you? Crow's man brought a bill of sale, said I'd agreed in February. Did you sign it? He stopped. His jaw worked. I don't remember signing it. Caleb. It was the first time she'd used his given name. She did it without softness, without deliberate familiarity, just the clean directness of a woman who needed a man to listen. I need you to think very carefully. Did you sign a bill of sale for 6 cattle in February? I signed something in February, he said. Crow said it was a payment extension. She held his gaze. Then you didn't sell 6 cattle. Someone sold them for you. The color that left his face in that moment was the same color the ranch had, she thought, the gray of a thing that's been drained without realizing it. That's theft, he said. Yes, that's... He stood up straighter. Something was moving behind his eyes now, something that had been lying down for too long and was just starting to find its legs. That's not debt. That's theft. Yes, she said again. And if they did it once, they did it more than once. Which means we need to go through every paper in that house before Sunday, because I think the number we're going to find doesn't match what Crow is telling you. He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was already fierce the way it gets in deep summer in Texas, and she was standing in it with her sleeves already rolled up and her notebook already full, and her eyes already set on the work ahead. Why are you doing this? He said. You came for dairy work. I came because I needed a position, she said. I'm staying because what's happening to this ranch is wrong, and because... She paused. Something crossed her face that wasn't quite sentiment and wasn't quite coldness. Because I watched someone take everything from my father slowly, and he never saw it coming, and I didn't know enough then to stop it. I know enough now." He was quiet. "So," she said, "are we going to stand here talking about why I'm helping you? Or are we going to go inside and find out exactly how much Elias Crow thinks he can steal before you notice?" Caleb Hartwell, a man who had been alone in his own trouble for nearly a year, who had gone quiet and smaller inside, while his ranch went quiet and smaller around him, looked at this woman he had known for less than 24 hours. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt something shift. "Let's go find out," he said. The papers were in a wooden box under his father's desk, and there were more of them than Caleb had looked at in months. He'd stopped opening the box sometime in early spring when every paper in it had started to feel like another verdict instead of a record. That was the thing about shame, it made you stop looking at the evidence of your own life. Abigail had no such hesitation. She spread the documents across the kitchen table in the methodical, unhurried way of a woman who had done this kind of work before organizing by date, by type, by party. Caleb sat across from her and watched, and when she asked him a question, answered it. She asked a great many questions. "When did Crow first approach you about buying the ranch?" "Last October, after the drought." "Before or after your two senior hands left?" Caleb paused. "After, but only by a couple of weeks." She wrote something down. "Why did they leave?" "Back wages," he said, and the words cost him something. "I couldn't meet payroll in September. They had families." "Did you owe them the wages, or did Crow advise you to reduce your workforce to cut costs?" He opened his mouth and closed it again. Crow's man mentioned that carrying a full crew was unnecessary during a drought consolidation period. She looked up from the papers. "Crow's man advised you to let your experienced hands go, and 2 weeks later Crow approached you about buying the land." The kitchen was very quiet. "I didn't," Caleb said, and then stopped because there was nothing to say after that didn't sound like the confession of a man who'd been walked right off a cliff while somebody held a friendly hand on his shoulder. "You didn't know," she said, and she said it without cruelty. "That's what it's designed for. That's why it works." She went back to the papers. "But we're going to prove it now." It took them most of the morning. The pattern that emerged from the documents was careful and deliberate, the work of a man who knew exactly how to drown a ranch by inches. Crow had started with the drought, a legitimate crisis, not of his making, and then used every subsequent decision point to guide Caleb toward isolation, undercapitalization, and exposure. The payroll advice. The emergency debt extensions that reset terms without Caleb fully reading them. The February bill of sale Caleb couldn't remember signing. By noon, Abigail had 4 items on a clean piece of paper. She pushed it across the table to Caleb. He read it. "Missing cattle," he said. "Diverted water access. Altered debt terms. False bill of sale." He looked up. "That's not a struggling ranch. That's a crime." "Yes," she said. "Now, the question is what we do about it before Sunday." He straightened in his chair, and Abigail watched it happen. Watched the thing that had been sagging in him these long months start to pull itself upright, not because someone had saved him, but because he finally understood what he was fighting. "We go to the sheriff," he said. "We build a case first," she said. "The sheriff in this town knows Crow. We show up with accusations and no proof, we get sent home. We show up with documents, witnesses, and facts." She tapped the piece of paper. "Then we have a conversation." "Witnesses," he said. "Denny. Denny's 18 and scared," she said. "We need someone else. Who else knows this ranch? Who would Crow not have gotten to yet?" Caleb thought. He was getting better at thinking she noticed less defending, less protecting his pride, more actual thinking. "Martha Bell," he said. "She runs the general store. My father used to run accounts there. She'd have records of what this ranch was buying and selling going back 10 years. "Good," Abigail said. "I'll go see her." "You don't know her?" "No," she said. "But I know what I'm looking for. And women who run their own businesses in frontier towns know more than people give them credit for." She stood, rolled her sleeves back down, smoothed the front of her dress. "Keep Denny busy today. Don't let him mention any of this in town. And fix that fence." Caleb blinked. "Which fence?" "All of it," she said. "Because whatever happens on Sunday, this ranch is going to look like a working operation by Saturday night. A dying ranch invites theft. A working ranch invites respect." She picked up her father's rifle from where she'd leaned it by the door, slung it over her shoulder, and walked out into the July heat. Behind her, she heard Caleb say quietly to no one, or maybe to himself, or maybe to her back, "Lord help me." She didn't slow down. There was too much work to do. Martha Bell was not a woman who wasted time on pleasantries before she'd decided whether a person was worth them. She looked at Abigail from across the counter of the general store, a long, flat look that took in the rifle, the dust on the hem of the dress, the notebook in the hand, and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then she said, "You're the woman Caleb Hartwell hired." "Yes, ma'am. Word travels fast in Dry Creek." "I've noticed," Abigail said. Martha folded her arms. She was 60, maybe 62, with the kind of face that had been pretty once and was now something better weathered into authority. She ran the general store the way a general runs a campaign, with absolute knowledge of every moving piece and zero tolerance for waste. "What do you want?" "Account records," Abigail said. "The Hartwell account. Everything your store has going back 10 years. Martha didn't move. "Those are private business records." "Yes, ma'am. And Caleb Hartwell's ranch is about to be sold at auction on Monday, unless someone can prove that the debt claims against it are fraudulent." Abigail set her notebook on the counter and opened it to her morning's work. "I've already found altered bill of sale terms, diverted water access that was deliberate, and cattle that were sold without the owner's knowledge or consent. What I need from you is a record of what that ranch was actually producing before Elias Crow started advising Caleb on how to run it." Martha looked at the notebook. She looked at Abigail. She was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable, and Abigail let it stretch without filling it. "Elias Crow," Martha said finally, "has been trying to buy land in this valley for 4 years. I know. He got the Dennison place last spring, the Yates spread before that. Same method." Martha's eyes sharpened. "You're asking if he's done this before. I'm asking if you've seen it before." Martha uncrossed her arms. She turned and walked to the back wall of the store, where a row of bound ledgers sat on a shelf above the dry goods organized by year in Martha's careful, precise hand. She pulled 4 of them without hesitation. "You're going to want to sit down," Martha said. "And you're going to want a pencil." Abigail spent 2 hours in Martha Bell's back room. What she found in those ledgers was not complicated. It was actually very simple, which was the worst part. The way the damage was so clear, once you laid the records side by side and stopped letting shame and drought and isolation blur the picture. The Hartwell Ranch had been a solid mid-size operation for 15 years under Caleb's father. Regular purchases, consistent output accounts paid on time, or close to it. When Caleb took over 2 years ago, the pattern held a capable man continuing capable work. Then last October, something shifted. Not the drought. The drought had been real. But the response to the drought that was where Crow's fingerprints appeared. Every decision that had weakened Caleb's position since October had been made following a conversation with Crow or Crow's representative. The payroll cut. The debt extension that reset the loan terms. The reduced breeding investment. Each one had been framed as emergency management. Each one had made the ranch more vulnerable. Martha watched her read. "You see it," she said. "Yes." "I saw it too," Martha said. "I just didn't have proof of the piece that mattered." Abigail looked up. "Which piece?" Martha reached under the counter and pulled out a folded paper she'd clearly been holding onto for some time, the kind of careful, deliberate holding that a woman does when she's waiting for the right moment to deploy something. She laid it on the table. It was a land survey map. Recent by the look of it. Fresh ink professional measurements. Caleb's property was outlined in clean lines. And running along its south boundary in a route that crossed directly through the Hartwell pasture land was a penciled-in track labeled Proposed Rail Spur San Antonio Northern Extension. Abigail stared at it. That railroad survey came through 6 weeks ago, Martha said. They're planning a spur line. It'll connect the Northern Valley ranches to the San Antonio cattle market directly. Cut 3 days off the drive and double the price per head for whoever owns land along the route. Abigail set the paper down very carefully. Caleb doesn't know about this. Crow does, Martha said. He's known since the spring. The survey team stopped here for supplies in April. Crow's man was in the store the same afternoon. Abigail's hand was very still on the table. When she looked up at Martha, something had gone cold and absolutely clear in her eyes. So Crow isn't just trying to buy cheap land, she said. No, Martha said. He's trying to steal a railroad fortune. She walked back to the ranch faster than she'd left it. Caleb was at the south fence when she came through the gate, working beside Denny with post-hole diggers and a focus that she recognized the focus of a man who'd been given a task and was using it to keep his mind from going somewhere dark. He'd replaced 3 posts already. The fence line that had been sagging since she arrived was beginning to straighten. She didn't say anything about the railroad yet, not until she'd thought about how to say it. Not until she'd figured out which pieces to move first, because what Martha Bell had just handed her was not just evidence, it was a motive. And a motive, this large, changed everything about how they needed to approach Sunday. "How'd the store owner receive you?" Caleb called, not stopping his work. "Well enough," she said. "She's a sharp woman. You trust her?" "My father did. That's good enough for me." Abigail nodded. She rolled up her sleeves and went to help Denny with the wire before she said anything else, because sometimes the best way to have a serious conversation was to have your hands occupied. It kept the emotion honest. "Caleb," she said after a moment, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it straight." He looked at her over the fence wire. "All right. Have you had any contact with the railroad survey teams? Any communication about your land?" The post-hole digger stopped. "Railroad survey teams." "Yes." "No, I didn't know there were any." He set the digger down. "Why?" "Because," she said carefully, "your south boundary is in the path of a proposed rail spur for the San Antonio Northern Extension. And if that spur is built, whoever owns this land will have direct rail access to the cattle market." Denny dropped the wire reel. Caleb stood very still. "That's—" He stopped, started again. "That would change everything. The cost of the drive alone, you could double your margin if you didn't have to push cattle 3 days to market." "Yes," she said. "And Crow knows that. He's known since April." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. The kind where a person is not just processing information, but processing betrayal, the specific nauseating sensation of realizing that what felt like bad luck was actually someone else's plan. "He's been doing this on purpose," Caleb said. "Not a question." "From the beginning," she said. "The drought gave him the opening. Everything since has been his management." Caleb pulled off his hat. He stood there with it in his hand and said nothing for a long, painful moment. Denny looked at the ground. Abigail waited. "He's not buying a failing ranch," Caleb said finally. "No. He's stealing a railroad right-of-way." "Yes." Caleb put his hat back on. His voice when it came was quieter than she expected, not broken, but stripped down. Ground-level honest. "My father built this place 30 years ago. He drove cattle himself in the beginning before he had enough to hire hands. He dug that well by hand, him and 2 neighbors. He would have—" He stopped. "He would have died before he let someone walk off with it." "You're not going to let someone walk off with it either," Abigail said. He looked at her. "But I need you to understand what we're up against," she said. "This isn't a desperate buyer. This is a calculated theft by a man with money connections and time, which means we can't just show the sheriff an altered contract and expect it to be enough. We need to go in with everything: the ledgers, the survey map, the bill of sale witnesses. We need to make a case so clear that Crow can't buy his way out of it." "Martha Bell," Caleb said. "She'll testify. She said she would. And she said she has customers who've done business with Crow in the past. 2 of them she thinks would talk. Who? She mentioned a man named Garrett, and someone called Hitch. Caleb nodded slowly. Tom Garrett. He lost his pasture lease 2 years ago. Always said the terms had been changed on him but couldn't prove it. He paused. If Crow did to Garrett what he did to me, it'll show a pattern, she said. And patterns are harder to dismiss than individual incidents. He looked at her with that same complicated expression she'd been seeing since yesterday, the one that mixed gratitude and something fiercer than gratitude. How do you know all this? He said. The legal piece, the evidence piece. She went back to the wire. My father was a careful man, she said. He taught me to read contracts because he said no one should ever sign something they don't understand. And after he died, after I watched someone use his own papers against his estate, she pulled the wire taut. I went and learned more. He was quiet a moment. I'm sorry about your father. Thank you, she said, and meant it simply without performance. They worked the fence for another hour without talking much, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who'd reached a temporary equilibrium, said enough, understood the next steps clear enough to carry them forward without a map. Then Denny said from the far end of the fence line, Mr. Hartwell, there's a rider coming up the north road. It was not Crow's men this time. It was a single man, middle-aged, wearing a badge that Abigail recognized as county sheriff before he was 20 yards from the gate. He rode easy the way a man does who isn't expecting a fight, but also isn't unprepared for one. He had a broad, sun-creased face, and the deliberately neutral expression of a man who'd learned to keep his reactions behind a professional mask. Hartwell, the sheriff said, pulling up at the gate. Sheriff Price, Caleb said. He didn't move from where he stood. Come to deliver news on Crow's behalf. Price's neutral expression flickered slightly. Come to ask you a few questions, he said. And there's no need for that tone. I work for this county, not for Elias Crow. Then you'll understand, Abigail said, stepping up beside Caleb. Why Mr. Hartwell is cautious about unexpected visits the week before a forced sale. Price looked at her. He had the eyes of a man who looked at people carefully before he spoke, and he took his time. You're the woman from the stagecoach, Mercer? Yes, sir. Word is you've been asking questions around town. Word travels fast in Dry Creek, she said, and did not apologize for it. Price shifted in his saddle. Crow filed a formal complaint this morning, he said. Claims you've been threatening his business interests, making false accusations against his financial practices. Crow filed a complaint, Caleb repeated. He said it flat without inflection, but his jaw had gone tight. I'm not saying I believe it, Price said. I'm saying I'm required to look into it. And while you're looking into it, Abigail said, would you also like to look into the altered debt terms in Caleb Hartwell's loan contract, or the forged bill of sale for 6 head of cattle, or the deliberate diversion of water access to his livestock? Price was quiet. Because I have documentation for all 3, she said. And a statement from Martha Bell at the general store regarding Crow's pattern of land acquisition in this valley, and a railroad survey map showing that Crow has financial motivation to acquire this specific parcel of land that goes considerably beyond the price he's offering. The sheriff looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Then he looked back at her. You put all that together, he said. In one day. I put together what was already there, she said. Someone just needed to stop being ashamed long enough to look at it. That landed. She hadn't meant it to land on Price, she'd meant it for Caleb. But the sheriff received it too, and something in his expression shifted. Not defensive, thoughtful. I'd want to see those documents, he said. Come to the house, Caleb said. And there was something different in his voice now. Something that had not been there yesterday, not been there this morning. The sound of a man who had stopped retreating. We'll show you everything we have. Price spent an hour at the kitchen table. He read carefully. He asked specific questions, a lawyer's questions, or close to it, the questions of a man who'd dealt with enough disputed claims to know which details mattered. When he got to the survey map, he went still for a moment, and Abigail watched the meaning of it land on him the way it had landed on her in Martha's back room. "Crow never mentioned this survey to you," Price said to Caleb. "First I heard of it was today," Caleb said. "He's had knowledge of it since April," Abigail said. "The survey team was in town. Martha Bell can confirm the date. Crow's man was present." Price sat back. He pulled at the edge of his mustache, a thinking habit. "What you're describing, if it's accurate, is a coordinated scheme of fraud. Multiple counts." He looked at Caleb. "That's federal territory. Land fraud of this scale doesn't stay county." "I know," Abigail said. "Which means Crow has more exposure than he knows," Price said slowly. "If this goes federal, which it will," she said, "if the evidence is what I think it is." Price looked at her with something that had moved past professional caution into something closer to respect. "You've done this before," he said. "I've been close to it before," she said. "From the wrong side. I understand how it works." Price stacked the papers carefully. "I can't stop Sunday's auction on the basis of what you've shown me. I don't have that authority alone. What I can do is file a formal request for a review of the debt terms with the county recorder's office. That buys time." He paused. "And I can be present at the auction, officially." "That's enough," Caleb said. "It might not be," Price said honestly. "Crow has friends on the county board. If he pushes hard enough, then we make sure Sunday is too public for him to push," Abigail said. "The auction is open, isn't it? Anyone in the county can attend." "That's correct." "Then we make sure people attend." She looked at Caleb. "Every rancher, every farmer, every store owner in this valley who has ever done business with Hartwell land. We make sure they're there. And we make sure they understand what they're watching." Caleb stared at her. "You want to make a public stand. I want Crow to have to commit his fraud in front of witnesses," she said. "Because men like Crow operate in the dark. They use private conversations, private documents, private pressure. You take that private act and put it in front of 100 people, and suddenly the math changes." Price stood. He picked up his hat. He looked at Caleb Hartwell with the expression of a man who'd come to deliver an inconvenient message and was leaving with something he hadn't expected. "Get your witnesses," he said. "Get your documents in order, and Hartwell." He stopped at the door. "Your father was a good man, and a fair one. Crow made a mistake when he picked this ranch." He glanced at Abigail. "A couple of mistakes, as it turns out." He left. The kitchen was quiet. Denny exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for the last hour. "He's going to help us," Caleb said. Not a question, but like he needed to hear it out loud. "He's going to do his job," Abigail said, "which is all we needed." She turned back to the table and pulled her notebook toward her. "Now, we have 4 days and we need 3 more witnesses. Tell me everything you know about Tom Garrett." They rode out to Garrett's place the next morning. Tom Garrett was a rangy, suspicious man of about 50 who met them at his porch with a shotgun and the expression of someone who'd learned the hard way that visitors meant trouble. When Caleb introduced Abigail, Garrett looked at her the way most men in Dry Creek looked at her, assessing, slightly contemptuous, willing to be convinced otherwise, but starting from a position of doubt. She let him look. "Heard you've been stirring things up at the Hartwell place," Garrett said. "Heard correctly," she said. "Heard you're making accusations against Crow." "I'm presenting evidence against Crow," she said. "There's a difference. Accusations are opinion. Evidence is documentation." Garrett's shotgun lowered slightly. "What kind of documentation?" She pulled out her notebook. And then the copies she'd made of the key documents. Careful, precise copies in her clear handwriting because she'd spent part of the previous night making sure she wasn't carrying irreplaceable originals into uncertain situations. Garrett read, slowly. He had the reading pace of a man for whom literacy was a tool, not a pleasure, but he read every word. When he got to the altered debt terms section, his jaw tightened. "That's the same thing," he said. "That's the exact same thing they did to my lease agreement." Tell me, Abigail said. He did. It took 30 minutes and a second cup of coffee that his wife silently produced without being asked, and it was a familiar story in its structure, the drought opening the friendly advice the document that seemed routine and turned out not to be. Garrett had lost a pasture lease of 300 acres. He'd always believed the terms had been manipulated, but had never been able to put the specific proof together. "You'd testify to this?" Abigail asked when he finished. Garrett looked at her. "Who's asking?" "I am," she said, "on behalf of Caleb Hartwell and every rancher in this valley who's going to wake up one morning and find Crow's fingerprints on their paperwork too." Garrett looked at Caleb. "She always talked like that." "Pretty much from the first minute," Caleb said. Something shifted in Garrett's face, a reluctant, slowly growing respect. "Yeah," he said. "I'll testify." Hitch was harder. His full name was Elwood Hitch, and he ran a small horse operation 12 miles east of Dry Creek, and the reason he was harder was not that he was dishonest or unwilling, but that Crow still held a financial instrument against his property, a note that if called would cause him serious damage. "I testify against Crow," Hitch said, standing in his barn with his arms crossed and his expression pained. "And he calls that note before Sunday. I lose the horses." "What if the note itself is fraudulent?" Abigail said. Hitch blinked. "What?" She pulled out the survey map. She explained the railroad. She watched Hitch's face go through the same sequence of expressions she'd seen on Caleb on Price on Garrett, the slow unfolding recognition of a man who'd been played longer and harder than he'd realized. "He holds that note," she said, "because your property has creek access, which this survey shows is also in the rail corridor." "Son of a—" Hitch stopped himself. "If Crow's fraud is proven at Sunday's auction," she said, "that note becomes subject to review along with everything else. A fraudulently obtained financial instrument doesn't hold in court. But if we don't prove it Sunday, he keeps everything," Hitch said. "Yes." Hitch was quiet for a long moment. His wife had come to the barn door, a small dark-haired woman who was clearly listening and had clearly heard enough. She caught Hitch's eye and gave him a very small nod. He saw it. He straightened. "All right," he said. "I'm in." They rode back to the Hartwell Ranch in the early evening, the sun going horizontal and orange across the valley, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Abigail allowed herself to feel something close to confidence. Not certainty. She wasn't a woman who confused confidence with certainty. But the shape of what they were building had become real. It had edges. It had weight. She felt Caleb watching her from the side. "You want to say something?" she said without looking at him. "I want to say a lot of things," he said. "I don't know which ones are appropriate." "Start with the appropriate one." He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved under them, steady and unhurried. "You didn't have to do any of this," he said. "You came for dairy work. You could have, when Crow's men showed up Tuesday night, you could have stepped back, made yourself small, stayed out of it." She looked at him. "Is that what you wanted me to do?" "No," he said immediately. "Then why bring it up?" "Because—" He stopped. He seemed to be working something out, finding the honest form of it. "Because I want you to know that I see it. What you're doing. I'm not taking it for granted." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she was not a woman who let sentiment overtake practicality. "We still need to get through Sunday." "I know. And Crow is going to know by tomorrow morning that we've been talking to Garrett and Hitch," she said. "Which means he'll move to discredit us before the auction, or worse." Caleb's expression hardened. "Worse how? Men like Crow don't lose gracefully," she said. "If he thinks his plan is falling apart, he'll try to dismantle us personally. Rumor pressure may be something more direct." She paused. "I want you to tell Denny to stay close to the house, and I want the documents stored somewhere Crow's men can't reach them." "Where?" "Martha Bell's," she said. "She's already holding the survey map. She can hold the rest." He nodded. "Done." Then, after a moment, Abigail. She looked at him again. He was holding her gaze with an openness that was slightly painful to look at, the expression of a man who wasn't comfortable being vulnerable, but was choosing to be anyway because the situation required honesty. "Whatever happens Sunday," he said, "this ranch, what it becomes, that's because of you. And I won't forget it." She looked at him for a long, measured moment. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We haven't won." She urged her horse forward, and he followed, and the valley spread out around them in the last of the evening light, the pastures that Crow wanted, the water that Crow had stolen, the land that a railroad company was quietly planning to make worth a fortune. And somewhere in Dry Creek, Elias Crow was receiving his nightly reports, getting the news that the dairy woman had been to see Garrett and Hitch, and beginning to understand that the quiet, careful trap he'd spent a year building had just found a problem he had not planned for. Her name was Abigail Mercer, and she was not done yet. Crow moved faster than she expected. She found out at dawn. Denny came to the barn where Abigail was already working his boots, unlaced his face the color of a boy who'd run harder than he was built for. He'd been in town the previous evening, visiting his mother, and had come back with news he'd clearly spent the whole night deciding how to deliver. "Miss Mercer," he said, breathing hard, "there's talk." She didn't stop what she was doing. "What kind?" "The bad kind." He swallowed. "About you. About why you're really here." She set down what was in her hands and turned to face him. "Tell me exactly what you heard, word for word." Denny looked at the ground. "People are saying, people at the saloon, at the feed store, they're saying you're not really a ranch worker. They're saying Caleb hired you to create a legal disturbance so he could delay the debt collection, that you're a professional troublemaker, that you've done it in other counties." He glanced up. "Some people are saying worse." "What are they saying that's worse?" He went red. "That you and Caleb, that the whole thing is a scheme, that there's no real evidence, that you made up the documents." She was quiet for a moment. Not upset, she had expected something like this had told Caleb 2 nights ago, that Crow would move to discredit them personally. But there was a difference between anticipating an attack and standing in the actual wreckage of it, and she allowed herself one breath to feel the full weight of it before she set it aside. "Who's saying it?" she said. "Crow's man, the one who came Tuesday night. He's been in the saloon since yesterday afternoon, buying drinks and talking." She picked up what she'd set down. "Go wake Caleb," she said. "Tell him we're leaving for town in 20 minutes. Denny blinked. "You're going into town. Now when everyone—" "Especially now," she said. "When everyone—" Caleb met her at the gate with his jaw set and his hat pulled low, which she had come to understand was his version of armor. He'd heard enough from Denny to know what they were walking into, and he'd chosen to walk into it anyway, which told her something important about the man he was becoming, or perhaps the man he'd always been buried under a year of losing. "You don't have to come," she said. "It's my ranch," he said flatly. "My name, my fight." She nodded once. They rode. The town of Dry Creek on a Thursday morning was not a large audience, but it was a present one. The kind of small town where information moved faster than horses, and everyone had already heard the saloon version of events before breakfast. She felt the looks as they came down the main street, not all hostile, not all friendly, but all watching. Martha Bell was standing in front of her store when they came through. She gave Abigail a look that said she'd been waiting. "How bad?" Abigail said, pulling up. "Bad enough," Martha said. "Crow's man has been telling it smooth. He's good at it. He made it sound reasonable, said you came from Kansas with a history of inserting yourself into debt disputes for a fee. Said there was never any real fraud, just a desperate rancher and a clever woman making noise." And people believed it. Martha's expression was careful and honest. Some did, some wanted to. It's easier to believe the familiar story. She paused. "But there are others. Garrett's been in town since early this morning and he's been talking back. He's got a temper, but he's got credibility too. People around here know Tom Garrett doesn't invent things." Caleb dismounted. "Where's Crow's man now?" Feed store, Martha said. Still talking. Caleb started walking. Abigail caught his arm. Not like that, she said. Not with anger. That's what he wants. He wants you angry and public, and looking unreasonable. You walk in there heated. You hand him exactly what he needs. Caleb stopped. He was breathing controlled and deliberate, the way a man breathes when he is actively choosing not to do what his body is demanding. Then how? He said. Calmly, she said. With the documents, in front of as many people as will listen. He looked at her. She looked back. He put the anger somewhere internal and deeper, somewhere he could use it later, when it would do something productive, and he nodded. All right, he said. Together. The feed store was occupied by 11 men when they walked in. Crow's man, she'd learned his name, was Voss Cole Voss, a lean and practiced talker with a salesman's smile, and a lawyer's careful relationship with the truth was mid-sentence when Abigail and Caleb came through the door. He stopped. The room turned. Voss recovered quickly. He had the trained instincts of a man who was paid to manage situations. Mr. Hartwell, he said with the easy warmth of someone who'd been expecting them. And Miss Mercer, I was just speaking with your neighbors. I heard, Caleb said. About what you said. Only what's true, Voss said. Then you won't mind saying it again, Abigail said, while I show these men what I've been looking at for the past 3 days. The room was very still. There is a specific quality of stillness in a small town when something is about to happen that everyone will be talking about for years, a collective held breath. She felt it, and she used it. She pulled the copied documents from her bag, organized and ready, and she put them on the counter in front of the feed store owner, a heavy-set man named Claude, who'd been listening to Voss for an hour and had the expression of a man not yet fully committed to a side. What you're looking at, she said, addressing the room, and not just Voss, is a loan extension document from February of this year. This is the original term sheet from the Hartwell loan signed 2 years ago. These are the terms as they appear in the current document Crow is using to demand Sunday's sale. She laid them side by side. The default trigger clause has been changed. The original requires 6 months of non-payment before forced sale can be initiated. The current document shows 60 days. That change was made without Caleb Hartwell's signature, without his knowledge. Voss was already moving. That's her interpretation. That's the document, she said. Flat, clean, not aggressive, just precise. Any man in this room who can read is welcome to compare them. Claude, the feed store owner, leaned forward and looked. 2 other men moved toward the counter. Voss changed approach. The documents have been in Miss Mercer's possession. She could have... The originals are with Martha Bell, Abigail said, who has held the Hartwell account records for 15 years and will confirm these copies are accurate. She looked at Voss directly for the first time, and she looked at him the way a woman looks at something she has already categorized and found insufficient. You can continue suggesting I fabricated evidence, Mr. Voss, but you'll be doing it in front of men who can read the originals at the general store within the next 5 minutes. So I'd consider your next words carefully. The room had shifted. Not dramatically. Small town rooms don't shift dramatically. They shift the way weather shifts degree by degree until you realize the wind is coming from a different direction. But Abigail felt it, and she believed Voss felt it too, because his next words were quieter and less certain than his first ones had been. Mr. Crow operates within the law, Voss said. Any changes to loan terms were made without the borrower's informed consent, Caleb said. He stepped forward, not with heat, with the controlled steadiness she'd asked for. I signed a payment extension in February, Cole, not a term amendment. If those 2 documents say different things, then someone changed one of them, and the only person with a reason to do that is Elias Crow. Claude, the feed store owner, straightened. He looked at Voss. That what happened, Cole? Voss said nothing. Claude nodded slowly. That nod meant more than anything that had been said because Claude had lived in Dry Creek for 30 years, and his opinion carried the specific weight of a man who'd never had reason to lie. I think, Claude said carefully, I'm going to go take a look at those originals. He walked out of his own store. 3 other men followed him. Voss was left with 4, and the 4 who stayed weren't the 4 she was worried about. By noon, the story Voss had been spending money on for 24 hours had developed a significant structural problem. Too many people had now read the documents. It is very difficult to successfully describe evidence as fabricated when the evidence is available for independent review in a reputable store run by a 60-year-old woman who has never in 30 years of business given anyone cause to doubt her word. Martha Bell had not asked permission to become a critical piece of this operation. She had simply done what she always did, kept careful records, told the truth when asked, and presented herself with the absolute unassailable confidence of a woman who knew that right and wrong were not complicated categories, even when the law tried to make them so. By 2 in the afternoon, Tom Garrett had given 3 separate informal accounts of his own experience with Crow's loan practices to 3 separate groups of men in 3 separate locations around town. He was not a polished speaker. He was better than polished. He was angry and specific and locally known, and people trusted angry and specific from a man they'd known 20 years considerably more than they trusted smooth and vague from an outsider with a salesman's smile. Voss left town at 3. Abigail watched him ride out from the window of Martha's back room, where she'd spent the afternoon helping Martha organize the documents that were now, thanks to the morning's events, considerably more visible and considerably more dangerous to Crow than they'd been 48 hours ago. "He's going to Crow," Martha said. "Yes," Abigail said. "What does Crow do next?" Abigail thought about it. She thought about the shape of a man like Crow, the calculation behind the charity, the patience behind the theft, the specific kind of pride that came with believing yourself too careful to be caught. "He has 2 options," she said. "He withdraws the sale and walks away, cuts his losses. Or he decides the auction is still his best move," she said. "He shows up Sunday with enough public confidence to override the documents. He's bought enough goodwill with enough people that he thinks he can still frame this as a desperate debtor and a hysterical woman making noise." Martha looked at her. "Which one do you think he picks?" Abigail looked out the window. "He picks Sunday," she said. "Men like Crow don't retreat. They double down. Because retreating means admitting they were wrong, and that kind of man would rather lose everything than say those words." Martha was quiet for a moment. "Then Sunday is going to be something." "Yes," Abigail said. "It is." That night, Crow came himself. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected another message, another representative, another careful piece of pressure delivered at a distance. What she hadn't expected was to hear horses at the Hartwell gate at 9 in the evening, and look out to see a man she'd only known by reputation, sitting on a very fine horse dressed well, carrying himself with the deliberate composure of someone who had decided that the way to handle this situation was to handle it personally. Elias Crow was not what she'd imagined. She'd imagined him larger somehow, more obviously threatening. What she saw was a man of perhaps 55, well-built, but not imposing, with a full gray beard, kept neat, and the kind of quality clothing that communicated wealth without shouting it. He had the face of a man who'd spent a lifetime being liked, which was in many ways more dangerous than the face of a man who'd spent a lifetime being feared. Caleb went to the door. She went with him. "Hartwell," Crow said. His voice was warm, practiced. The voice of a man at a church social, not a confrontation. "I thought it was time we spoke directly. May I come in?" "No," Caleb said. Crow's expression registered a flicker of something not surprise but recalibration. He looked at Abigail. "Miss Mercer," he said, and there was something in the way he said it almost respectful, the acknowledgement of someone he'd underestimated and was now reassessing. "I've heard a great deal about you this week." "I've heard a great deal about you for considerably longer," she said. He smiled. It was a real smile, not a performed one, which was somehow worse. "I'd like to propose a solution," he said. "One that's good for everyone." "I doubt that," she said. "But go ahead." Crow looked at Caleb. "I'll withdraw the Sunday deadline. I'll reset the debt terms to the original 6-month default trigger. In exchange, he paused. You sell me the South 40 acres, the creek pasture. The creek pasture, the land that ran directly along the proposed rail corridor. Caleb started to speak. Abigail touched his arm just briefly, a signal, not a restraint. Why the South 40 specifically? She said. Crow spread his hands. It's the most logical parcel for a railroad right-of-way, she said. The smile stayed in place, but something behind it went very still. I don't know what you're referring to. The San Antonio Northern Extension Survey, she said. April of this year. Your man was at Martha Bell's store the same afternoon the survey team was in town. She let that sit for a moment. You've known for 2 months that the south boundary of this ranch is worth 15 times its current cattle value. And that's the parcel you want. Just that parcel. Just the one that happens to sit directly in the path of a future rail spur. Crow looked at her for a long moment. The warm expression had not disappeared, but it had become something different, the face a man wears when he is doing very rapid arithmetic and does not particularly like the results. That survey is speculative, he said. Rail projects fail all the time. Then you won't mind explaining to the county recorder's office why you've been systematically acquiring land along its proposed route for the past 2 years, she said. Silence. I have a better proposal, she said. You withdraw the Sunday deadline permanently. You restore the original loan terms in full. You return the 6 cattle sold under the forged February bill of sale, or their market equivalent in cash, and you resign any claim on Hartwell land in any form. In exchange, she paused. We present the evidence we have to Sheriff Price for his review and allow the legal process to determine whether criminal charges are appropriate. Crow's expression had gone very quiet. You're offering me a deal. I'm offering you the closest thing to a clean exit you're going to get, she said, because the alternative is Sunday, and on Sunday we present everything we have in front of every rancher, every merchant, and every concerned citizen in this valley, including the railroad map, including Tom Garrett's testimony, including Elwood Hitch's account of his note. She met his eyes and held them. You've been doing this for 4 years in this valley, Mr. Crow. I think you'll find Sunday's audience has some feelings about that. Crow was quiet for a long time. You're bluffing, he said finally. Not with confidence, with the tone of a man testing a rope he's not sure will hold. Am I? She said. It was not a question. She said it the way a woman says something she already knows the answer to and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. Crow looked at Caleb. You'd let a woman you've known for 4 days make decisions about your ranch. I'd let a person who's shown me more about my own land in 4 days than I learned in 2 years make decisions that affect us both, Caleb said. And she happens to be a woman. That's your problem, not mine. Crow looked at them both. He looked at the documents visible through the open door on the kitchen table. He looked at the dark valley beyond the ranch fence, and whatever he was calculating in those few seconds, it did not appear to be resolving in his favor. I'll consider your terms, he said. You have until Saturday morning, she said. After that, the conversation happens in public. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of courtesy that under the circumstances was almost surreal, and rode out. The gate closed behind him. Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. Then he turned and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not gratitude, not admiration. Something more complicated and more real than either of those things. You just negotiated with Elias Crow, he said. I stated our terms, she said. Whether he accepts them is his choice. You think he will? She was honest. No, she said. I think he'll come to Sunday and try to overwhelm us with money and confidence and the assumption that no one in this town will trust a woman and a struggling rancher over him. She paused. Which is why Sunday needs to be undeniable. He looked at her. What do we still need? One more thing, she said. She went to the table and picked up the one document she'd been thinking about all day, the one gap in their evidence that she hadn't yet been able to fill. The forged February bill of sale. I have Caleb's account of it. I have the inconsistency in the records, but what I don't have is proof of who physically altered the document. Crow will say his records show a legitimate transaction. We need to show how it was done. How do we get that? She sat down, thought, and then said slowly, Crow's bookkeeper. Caleb frowned. What about him? Every man who alters documents has someone who helps him do it, she said. A bookkeeper, a clerk, a notary. Someone with access to the original papers. She looked up. Who processes Crow's business records locally? Caleb thought. He uses a man named Aldous Webb, has a small office above the hardware store. Does Webb know what he's helping Crow do? I don't know. Does Webb have his own financial exposure to Crow? Caleb was quiet a moment. His brother borrowed from Crow 2 years back. I don't know if the note's been settled. She stood. Then tomorrow morning, we go see Mr. Webb. Aldous Webb was a small, thin, nervous man who looked at them when they came through his office door, like a rabbit looks at a shadow with the specific terror of an animal that knows it's in a situation it cannot outrun, but hasn't yet decided which direction to try. He knew who they were. That was immediately clear. He'd known they were coming the way everyone in Dry Creek seemed to know everything through the osmotic small-town information system that had been working against them, and she was beginning to believe might now start working for them. Mr. Webb, she said, sitting across from his desk without being invited to. I'm going to ask you something and I'd like an honest answer. I'm not here to get you in trouble. I'm here because I need to understand exactly what happened to a document in February of this year. Webb's hands were folded on the desk. His knuckles were slightly white. I process Mr. Crow's routine business documents, he said carefully. I'm not party to. You notarized the February bill of sale for 6 Hartwell cattle, she said. He went very still. I have the notary stamp in the document record, she said. Your seal, which means you were present when that document was formalized, which means you know whether Caleb Hartwell signed it willingly under full knowledge of its contents, or whether something else occurred. Webb looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing. He just looked back with the steady, exhausted honesty of a man who had been wronged and knew it and was done pretending otherwise. I was told, Webb said finally, and his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper, that Mr. Hartwell had agreed verbally, and that the signature would be obtained separately. I was told it was a standard emergency debt settlement. I processed the notarization on Crow's assurance. And the signature on the document? Webb said nothing. Mr. Webb, she said quietly, your brother's note with Crow. Does it have a standard default clause? He flinched. It was slight but visible, and it told her everything. Because if it does, she said, and if Crow decides to call that note the way he called Hartwell's, the way he manipulated Garrett's, the way he's been doing in this valley for 4 years, I want you to understand that the evidence we're presenting on Sunday is going to include the full pattern of Crow's practices. She leaned forward slightly. Which means when this case goes to a federal court, and it will go to a federal court because land fraud of this scale is a federal matter, everything associated with Crow's operations gets reviewed, including any instrument he holds against your brother's property. Webb was breathing carefully, controlled. The breathing of a man trying very hard to think clearly when his hands wanted to shake. If you tell me the truth today, she said, and if you're willing to give a statement to Sheriff Price about what you witnessed in February, I will personally ensure that your name appears in our evidence as a witness, not as a participant. There is a significant difference between those two things in a court of law. A long, fragile silence. Then Webb said, the signature was not obtained in my presence. She kept her face steady. Go on. I was given the document after the fact and asked to backdate the notarization. I was told it was a formality, that Hartwell had signed but hadn't been available for the official witnessing. He paused. I knew it wasn't proper procedure. I told myself it was a small thing. Will you say that to Sheriff Price? He closed his eyes, opened them. In those few seconds, she watched a man make the decision to stop being complicit in something that had been slowly corroding him, and it was not a dramatic decision. It was quiet and painful and very real. "Yes," he said, "I will." They were back at the ranch by late afternoon, and the case they were walking into Sunday with was no longer a case built on inference and documentation. It was a case built on a witness to the fraud itself. Caleb didn't celebrate. Neither did she. What they felt, what she could see in him, and what she recognized in herself, was not the lightness of victory, but the focused, forward-leaning energy of people who understood that the hardest part was still ahead. Saturday came and went without word from Crow. He had not accepted her terms. She'd known he wouldn't. She'd made the offer because it was the right thing to make, and because watching him refuse it would tell her something important about how he'd behave on Sunday. What it told her was that he intended to perform. He intended to walk into that auction with the confidence of a man who believed the audience was his, and he intended to make Caleb look small and her look fraudulent, and he intended to do it so publicly and so completely that no amount of documentation would survive the social damage. She spent Saturday night going over every piece of evidence one final time. She was sitting at the kitchen table when Caleb came in from his last check of the cattle and found her still working by lamplight. He sat down across from her. "You should sleep," he said. "I'll sleep Monday," she said. He watched her work for a moment. "Are you scared?" he said. She looked up. It was not a question she'd expected from him, too direct, too personal, the kind of question a man who's been carrying his own fear for months finally asks when he's ready to share the weight of it. "Yes," she said honestly. "A little." "What does that feel like?" he said. "For you." "When you're scared and you move forward anyway," she thought about it. "Like standing at the edge of a creek crossing when you don't know the bottom," she said. "You know the reasons to go forward outweigh the reasons to stay. You know what's waiting on the other side matters, so you step in." He was quiet a moment. "My father used to say, courage isn't the absence of fear," Caleb said. "It's just deciding the thing you're afraid of losing matters more than the fear." She looked at him across the table, at the man who'd stood broken in a dying yard 4 days ago and was now sitting straight, present and ready. "He was right," she said. Caleb held her gaze. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. She went back to her notes. He stayed at the table with his coffee and didn't leave, and the lamp burned between them in the Texas night, and outside the summer heat pressed against the walls of the house. And somewhere in Dry Creek, Elias Crow was preparing his final performance. Neither of them slept much. Neither of them needed to. Sunday arrived the way trouble always does in Texas, without apology, full heat from the first hour, the kind of morning that made lesser intentions wilt before noon. Abigail was dressed and ready before the sun cleared the ridge. She had the documents in a satchel that she checked 3 times, not from doubt, but from the discipline of a woman who understood that preparation was the only thing standing between justice and performance. Every paper in order. Every copy accounted for. Martha Bell had the originals. Webb had his statement ready. Garrett and Hitch had both confirmed the night before that they would be at the auction yard by 9. Caleb came out of the house with his good hat and his father's boots and said nothing. She said nothing back. They understood each other well enough by then that silence between them carried its own vocabulary. Denny rode behind them, trying very hard to look older than 18. The auction yard was at the east end of Dry Creek's main street, a wide open space with a raised wooden platform that the county used for cattle sales public notices, and once a year, the Summer Harvest Festival. It was the most public place in a 30-mile radius, which was precisely why Crow had chosen it. He'd assumed that public humiliation was his weapon. He had not counted on Abigail turning the same room into a courtroom. The crowd was larger than she'd expected. She'd spent 2 days asking Martha and Garrett and Hitch to spread the word, not with alarm, not with accusation, just with the quiet suggestion that Sunday's auction involved matters that affected every rancher in the valley, and that interested parties might want to be present. The response told her that Dry Creek had been waiting for a reason to gather, had been feeling for some time that something was wrong in the valley without having anyone name it precisely. She counted 30, then 40, then more. Ranchers she didn't know by name. Women from town who'd come with their husbands or come alone. Claude from the feed store. 2 men she recognized from the saloon who'd been in the room when she'd laid out the documents on Thursday. Sheriff Price was there, standing to the side of the platform in his official posture badge, visible, watching everything with the careful neutrality of a man who had chosen which side of history he intended to land on, but was not yet ready to announce it. Crow arrived at 9:15. He came with 4 men, not the hired muscle type he'd sent on Tuesday, but well-dressed men, the kind who carried briefcases and wore city shoes, and moved with the specific confidence of people who expected their presence alone to resolve disputes. He had a county official with him, a minor clerk named Duval, who handled auction proceedings and who looked deeply uncomfortable about the size of the crowd. Crow scanned the yard when he arrived. She watched him do it, the practiced survey of a man who was accustomed to reading a room before he entered it. She watched him clock the numbers, reassess, and then reassemble his confidence in about 3 seconds flat. That told her something important. He'd seen bigger crowds than this, and he'd won them. He found her in the crowd. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully read, not contempt, not fear, something in between, something that acknowledged for the first time that she was a genuine problem. He tipped his hat. She did not respond. Duval called the proceedings to order with the nervous energy of a man who had not been briefed on what kind of morning this was going to be. He read the notice in the flat procedural tone of county officials. Everywhere the Hartwell property, the outstanding debt, the terms of the forced sale, the opening bid registered by Crow Capital at the assessed value minus the claimed debt balance. Crow's city shoemen spread out slightly. Caleb's jaw tightened. Then Crow stepped up to the platform. He spoke the way a preacher speaks, with warmth, with weight, with the practiced rhythm of a man who'd given this speech before in different forms. He expressed regret. He described his long relationship with the Hartwell family, the drought, the sad inevitability of circumstances beyond anyone's control. He used the word unfortunate 4 times. He made it sound like he was doing Caleb a favor by buying the land instead of letting it rot. The crowd was quiet, not won over, but quiet, the kind of quiet that goes either way. Then he made his mistake. "I understand," Crow said with a tone that sharpened very slightly, "that there have been certain allegations made this week by individuals with limited familiarity with the Valley's financial history. Claims that I can only describe as the desperate actions of a man who has run out of options, and a woman who—" He paused, choosing his words with visible deliberation. "Who perhaps overestimates her understanding of matters that are considerably more complex than they appear." The yard went very still. Not because of the insult, because of what it revealed. A man who is confident in his position does not stop to insult the opposition. A man who insults the opposition is a man who has already felt the ground shifting under him. Abigail stepped forward. She did not ask permission. She did not wait for Duval to acknowledge her. She simply moved to the front of the crowd with the satchel in her hand and the specific, quiet authority of a woman who had been building toward this moment for 6 days and was not going to be managed out of it by tone or implication. "Mr. Duval," she said, "before this auction proceeds, I'm requesting the opportunity to present evidence of fraud relevant to the debt claim being used to justify this sale." Duval blinked. "This is a county auction proceeding, Miss Mercer," she said, "and fraud vitiates a sale. That's not my opinion, that's established legal principle. If there is evidence that the debt instrument being used to force this auction was obtained through fraud, the sale cannot legally proceed." She looked at Price. "Sheriff Price, will you confirm that you've reviewed the evidence I submitted to your office yesterday and that you consider it sufficient to warrant review?" Price stepped forward. He had the expression of a man who had made peace with his decision. "I can confirm that," he said. "The evidence Miss Mercer submitted raises serious questions about the validity of the debt instrument being used in this proceeding. I've filed a formal request for review with the county recorder's office." A murmur went through the crowd. Crow's expression had not changed, but one of his city shoemen leaned toward him and said something quietly. Crow did not look at him. "A review request," Crow said, "does not halt an auction." No, Abigail agreed. But fraud does. She opened the satchel. And I'd like to demonstrate in front of everyone present exactly what fraud looks like in practice. She laid the documents on the platform railing. The original loan terms side by side with the current document, the February bill of sale, and the railroad survey map. She'd done this in the feed store on Thursday in front of 11 men. She was doing it now in front of nearly 100, and the scale of the audience changed nothing about the evidence and everything about its impact. She spoke clearly without drama, without raising her voice. She explained the altered default clause. She explained the discrepancy in the cattle count. She explained the forged bill of sale and what it meant, not in legal language, but in the plain direct language of a woman explaining to her neighbors what had been done to one of theirs. Then she held up the railroad survey map. This, she said, is why. She explained the rail spur, the proposed route, the value of the creek pasture land that Crow had tried to acquire separately on Saturday night. The specific calculated connection between the survey, the acquisition timeline, and every decision Crow had made about the Hartwell Ranch in the past year. The crowd had stopped murmuring. They were completely still. Then Tom Garrett spoke from where he stood in the crowd, loudly enough for everyone to hear. He did the same thing to my lease, same method, reset the terms without my knowing. I lost 300 acres to it. Hitch's voice came from the other side. He holds a note against my horses, same kind of instrument. And then from near the back of the crowd, a voice she didn't recognize. A man she'd never met said, he bought the Dennison place the same way. Everyone knew something was wrong, but nobody could say what. Crow turned toward that last voice. And that turn, that involuntary, reactive turn, was the tell. It was the movement of a man who had just understood that the ground he was standing on was considerably more populated with opposition than he'd believed. He turned back to the crowd. The warmth in his expression had not disappeared, but it had become effortful. She could see the effort now, the maintenance of it. These are allegations, he said. Unverified claims from interested parties. Then verify them, she said. Right now, in front of these people. She turned to Duvall. Mr. Duvall, I have a witness who can speak to the notarization of the February bill of sale. His name is Aldous Webb. He's present. Duvall looked around the crowd. Is Mr. Webb? Here, Webb said. He was standing at the edge of the yard. He looked terrible pale, tightly wound, the expression of a man who'd spent a sleepless night arriving at a decision he couldn't take back. But he was there, and he stepped forward. Crow looked at Webb. Webb did not look at Crow. Mr. Webb, Abigail said, the February bill of sale for 6 head of Hartwell cattle. Were you present when Caleb Hartwell signed that document? Webb's voice was not steady, but it was audible. No, he said. I was not. Was Caleb Hartwell's signature on the document when it was brought to you for notarization? A long pause. The longest pause of the morning. Webb's hands were clasped in front of him, and his knuckles were the same color as his face. No, he said. It was not. The crowd erupted. Not in chaos, in the specific human sound of a large group of people simultaneously having their suspicions confirmed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was the sound of a valley that had been losing things slowly for years, finally understanding what had been taking them. Crow moved. Fast for a man his age, he stepped toward the platform with the sudden decisive movement of someone who'd made a calculation and was executing on it before the situation degraded further. He reached for the survey map that Abigail had laid on the railing. Caleb stepped in front of him, not with aggression, not with violence. He simply moved his body between Crow and the evidence, and he stood there with his full height and his father's boots and his good hat and the specific, immovable quality of a man who had spent 6 days rediscovering what he was standing for. No, Caleb said. One word, no heat, no shake. Just the absolute ground-level refusal of a man who was done being moved. Crow looked at him. Something in the look was almost respect. The involuntary acknowledgement one adversary gives another when the game is clearly over. You're making a serious mistake. Crow said quietly enough that only the front of the crowd heard it. "I made my serious mistakes," Caleb said. "When I trusted you, when I stopped reading my own contracts, when I let shame keep me from looking at what was happening to my own land." He paused. "I'm done making those." Price moved. He was beside Crow in 3 steps, and he put his hand on Crow's arm with the practiced ease of a man who'd done this before, not violent, not theatrical, simply firm. "Mr. Crow," he said, "I'm going to ask you and your associates to remain in the yard while I get the county recorder on the line. We have some documents that need official review before anyone goes anywhere." Crow looked at Price, at Caleb, at Abigail, at the crowd of nearly 100 people who were watching him with the specific collective expression of a community that has just understood it has been robbed and is deciding what to do about that feeling. He said nothing. That silence was his answer. Duval, to his credit, made the right call. "This auction is suspended," he said in the thin voice of a man who was very relieved to have a procedurally correct reason to say so. "Pending review of the documentation presented. All parties will be notified of a rescheduled date following the county recorder's assessment." One of Crow's city shoemen tried to object. Price silenced him with a look. Abigail stood at the railing with her satchel and her father's careful legacy of reading everything and signing nothing she didn't understand, and she let out a breath that she had been holding, it felt like since Tuesday morning. Martha Bell came to stand beside her. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, which was exactly the right thing. Then Garrett was there. Then Hitch. Then Claude from the feed store. Then the man she didn't know who'd spoken about the Dennison place. They gathered not in a dramatic cluster, but in the natural gravitational way of people who've been through something together and need to occupy the same space for a moment. Caleb found her through the crowd. He didn't push his way to her. He waited until the immediate noise settled and then walked over with the quiet deliberateness of a man who wasn't performing anything. He stood in front of her. "It's not over," she said before he could speak. "He'll fight the review. He has county connections. This could take months." "I know," he said. "The ranch still has real debt," she said. "Even with the fraudulent amounts removed, there are legitimate obligations. We need to restructure." "Abigail," he said. She stopped. He looked at her with the expression she'd been seeing develop over 6 days. The one that had started as shame and moved through confusion and trust, and something she hadn't let herself name, because there were more important things to focus on. "Thank you," he said. "Not for saving the ranch. For making me look at it. For not letting me sign it away without knowing what I was giving up." She held his gaze. "You're the one who let me look," she said. "That wasn't nothing, Caleb. Most men wouldn't have." He was quiet a moment. Around them the crowd was dispersing slowly. Conversations breaking out in clusters, the particular energy of a community that had just shared something consequential and was processing it in the way communities do, through repetition, through comparison, through the gradual construction of a shared story. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask it." "When the review is done, when this is settled, are you planning to leave?" She looked at him directly. The question deserved a direct answer. "I don't know," she said. "I came for dairy work and a wage. What's here now is considerably more complicated than that." "Yes," he said. "It is." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking because I need more help with the ranch. I want to be clear about that." "Then why are you asking?" He took his hat off that gesture she'd learned to read, the one that meant he was choosing vulnerability over protection. "Because the answer matters to me," he said. "Separate from the ranch, separate from the debt and the evidence, and Sunday and all of it." He paused. "You matter to me, Abigail, and I don't want to assume that's mutual. But I also don't want to be the kind of man who doesn't say it." The yard was quieter now. Most of the crowd had moved to the edges, to conversations, to the beginning of the long process of community reckoning that would follow this morning for weeks. The sun was high and merciless, and the dust had settled back into the familiar summer stillness of Dry Creek, Texas. She looked at Caleb Hartwell, at the man who'd stood in a dying yard 6 days ago trying to pretend he wasn't losing everything. And she thought about her father, who had taught her to read every document before signing it, who had taught her that gratitude and obligation were not the same as love, and that she should never let anyone convince her otherwise. "Gratitude isn't love," she said. "No," he agreed immediately. "It isn't. And rescue isn't partnership." "No," he said. "It isn't that either." "Then what are you offering?" she said. He met her eyes without flinching. "Equal ground," he said. "Your name on the decisions. Your judgment counted the same as mine. Not because you earned it this week, though you did, but because that's what this place deserves to be, and what I want to be the kind of man who builds." He paused. "And because I'd like the chance to know you without a crisis happening at the same time." She was quiet for a moment, not uncertain thinking, measuring the distance between what a woman is supposed to accept and what she actually wants, the way she'd been measuring distances her entire life. "I'll stay through the review process," she said. "We restructure the legitimate debt, we stabilize the herd, we get the dairy producing at proper capacity. We see what this ranch actually is when it's not being stolen from." She paused. "And we see what this is between us when there's nothing urgent left to fight." Something moved across his face. Not relief, something quieter and more durable than relief. "That's fair," he said. "It's the only thing I know how to be," she said. He put his hat back on. Behind them, Price was managing Crow's associates toward a formal statement process. Webb had been surrounded by 3 people asking him questions. Martha Bell was in conversation with 2 women who had the focused intent expressions of people who had decided to get involved in something. Garrett was shaking hands with the man from the Dennison place. The valley was beginning to understand what had been done to it. That understanding was not going to be quick or clean or without cost. But it was real, and it was started, and it could not now be put back. Caleb and Abigail stood side by side in the Sunday heat, not touching, not performing, just present in the same space, facing the same direction for the first time on equal ground. Denny appeared at Caleb's elbow with the expression of a young man who had just witnessed the most significant event of his 18 years and wasn't sure whether to cheer or cry. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, "what do we do now?" Caleb looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at the road back to the ranch at the direction of the repaired fence and the restored water access and the dairy that was already producing again, and the south pasture that a railroad company was going to want on their terms at a fair price to a man who would still own it. "We go home," she said. "There's work to do." They went home. And home. Abigail was beginning to understand was not a place she had expected to find in Dry Creek, Texas, in the summer of 1888. Home had been a word she'd carried carefully for years, the way you carry something that's been broken once and mended imperfectly useful, but fragile, held at a certain angle to keep the crack from spreading. Her father's house had been home. After that, nothing quite was. A series of positions, a series of rooms, a series of mornings in other people's spaces where she woke and remembered that nothing in the room belonged to her. The Hartwell Ranch was not hers, but when they rode back through the gate that Sunday afternoon, something in her body recognized the land in a way that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with investment. She had put herself into this place. Her knowledge, her judgment, her father's lessons, her own hard-won understanding of what fraud looked like and how it moved and where it hid. You cannot pour that much of yourself into a fight for a piece of ground without the ground meaning something afterward. The dairy cow lowed when she came into the barn. Abigail went to her first before anything else because the work didn't stop for drama, and the cow didn't care about auction yards. Caleb watched her from the barn door. "You always do that," he said. "Do what?" "Go straight to the animal. Before you eat, before you rest. First thing." "She can't feed herself," Abigail said. "No," he said. "But most people would sit down first." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Most people aren't responsible for a dairy cow." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that had been rare on his face when she arrived, and was becoming less rare, not a performance of happiness, but the real thing. The expression of a man who was slowly remembering what it felt like to not be losing. She did not say anything about the smile, but she saw it. She filed it. The county recorder's review took 11 days. 11 days in which the Hartwell Ranch did not pause its work for a single hour, because pausing work for 11 days was how a ranch fell behind, and falling behind was how Crow had gotten his opening in the first place. Abigail understood that the best argument they could make for their future was to build it in real time visibly, without waiting for external permission. She restructured the dairy operation in the first 3 days. The milk cow was healthy again and producing well. And by the end of the first week, Abigail had arranged a supply agreement with Martha Bell's store, fresh milk and butter, consistent quantity, fair price. The kind of straightforward, honest commerce that the ranch had once been built on and could be built on again. She went through every remaining piece of paper in the wooden box under Caleb's father's desk. Every bill of sale, every breeding record, every account note. She built a clear picture of what the ranch legitimately owed, stripped of Crow's manipulations, and she sat down with Caleb and Denny and spread it across the kitchen table, the way she'd spread the fraud evidence without softening, without panic, with the plain directness of someone who believed that honest numbers, even difficult ones, were better than comfortable lies. Actual debt, she said, tapping the relevant page. After removing the fraudulent instruments is manageable. Not easy, but manageable. If the dairy income holds and we bring the cattle count back up through a responsible breeding cycle, you're looking at 2 years of careful operation before you're genuinely clear. Caleb studied the numbers. 2 years. 2 honest years, she said, as opposed to the alternative. He nodded slowly. What do we need first? 2 more milk cows, she said. And someone to help Denny with the fence work so we can get the south pasture properly operational before the railroad people come to negotiate. Caleb looked up. You think they'll come? I think when a rail company hears that the landowner they need is no longer in debt distress and no longer vulnerable to acquisition by proxy, they'll come to the table directly. She paused. And they'll negotiate fairly because they'll have to. He was quiet for a moment. You've thought about all of this. I've been thinking about all of this since Tuesday, she said. He looked at her with that expression again, the one that had been developing across 11 days of fence work and early mornings and quiet suppers and conversations that ran longer than either of them had planned, because they kept finding more things they wanted to say. It was not a simple expression. It contained respect and something warmer than respect, and the particular quality of a man who was paying attention, not just to what a woman said, but to how she thought. The 2 more milk cows, he said. I know a man east of here who's selling a good pair, fair price. Can we afford it this week? If Martha's first payment comes in, yes. Then go Tuesday, she said. Take Denny. He needs to learn how to assess stock. Caleb nodded. And then, because he was a man who'd been learning all month that saying things directly cost less in the long run than not saying them, you're good at this, Abigail. Not just the crisis piece, the building piece. You're good at it. She looked at him. So are you, she said. When you're not letting someone else tell you what your own land is worth. He accepted that without defensiveness, that she thought was one of the truest measures of a person, whether they could receive an honest observation without needing to argue it down. The county recorder's finding came on a Wednesday. Price brought it himself, which told her before he opened his mouth that it was significant. He came in the late afternoon, sat at the kitchen table, and put the official document in front of Caleb, with the expression of a man delivering something he was genuinely glad to deliver. The debt instrument used to justify Sunday's auction has been found to contain material alterations inconsistent with the original loan agreement, Price said. The forced sale clause is invalidated. The February bill of sale for 6 head of cattle has been referred to the Federal Land Office on grounds of forged notarization. He paused. Crow has been formally notified that 3 additional properties in this valley, the Dennison parcel Garrett's former lease and Hitch's note, are under investigation as part of a pattern of fraudulent land acquisition. Caleb sat very still, It's not over, Price continued. Federal investigations move slowly. Crow has attorneys and he'll use them. But the auction claim is gone. The fraudulent debt is unenforceable. Your ranch is yours, Hartwell. Clear of the instruments he was using against you. Caleb put both hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at Abigail. She felt the weight of the moment. The full compound weight of everything the past 11 days had been compressed into this single point of resolution. She felt it, and she let herself feel it for exactly the amount of time it deserved, and then she said, "What about the 6 cattle?" Price almost smiled. Crow has been given 30 days to produce the animals or their market equivalent in restitution. If he fails, he spread his hands. Federal matter. He'll produce them, she said. He'd rather pay than have federal agents going through his records. That's my read, too, Price said. He stood, picked up his hat, and looked at both of them with the expression of a man who'd been doing this job for a long time and didn't often get to sit on the right side of a moment like this one. Your father, he said to Caleb, would have been proud. He left. The kitchen was quiet. Denny, who had been standing in the doorway trying to look like he wasn't listening, exhaled so loudly that it broke the silence completely. So it's over, he said. The worst of it, Abigail said. What's the not worst of it? Work, she said. Same as always. Denny grinned. It was the grin of a young man who'd been through something that had made him older in the right ways and was starting to feel the difference. Caleb still had his hands flat on the table. He lifted them slowly, deliberately, and stood. He did not make a speech. He was not a man given to speeches. He simply walked to the window, looked out at the ranch that was still his, and was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who is putting something down that they've been carrying for a very long time. Then he turned around and said, I need to send word to Martha, and to Garrett, and Hitch. I'll go to Martha, Abigail said. You send word to the others. Together first, he said. Give me 5 minutes. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the clear, unhurried intention of a man who had decided to stop letting urgency override what actually mattered. 5 minutes, she said. He took 4. What he said in those 4 minutes, standing in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and the Wednesday afternoon coming through the window, was not elaborate. He said that he had spent a year becoming smaller in his own life, one decision at a time, each one feeling like a reasonable response to an impossible situation, until he'd reached the place where he was standing in his own yard, not recognizing it. He said that she had walked through his gate and refused to let him stay in that place. He said that the ranch would not have survived without her, and that he knew that, and that he was going to spend a considerable amount of time making sure she knew it was seen and valued. But that's not what I want to say, he said. What I want to say is separate from the ranch. Then say it, she said. I'd like to court you properly, he said, if you're willing. Not because I owe you, not because you've been here and the situation is convenient, because I've spent 11 days watching how you think and how you work and how you treat people who can't do anything for you. Denny Webb Hitch's wife and I have never in my life met a woman I respected more. And respect, he paused. Respect for me is where love starts. She was quiet. She looked at him with the measuring, honest gaze she'd been giving him since Tuesday. The look that took nothing on faith and required everything to earn its place. You understand, she said, that courting me means treating my judgment as equal to yours in every matter that concerns this ranch and this life. Not courtesy, not indulgence, equal. Yes, he said without hesitation. And you understand that if at any point that changes, then you walk, he said. And you'd be right to. She was quiet another moment. Then she said, All right, Caleb. He let out a breath. Just one and quiet, but she heard it, and it told her something true about how much the answer had mattered. Now, she said, picking up her bag. I'm going to Martha's. You send word to Garrett and Hitch. Yes, ma'am, he said. She was almost at the door when he said Abigail. She turned. Thank you, he said, for staying. She held his gaze for a moment. Thank you for being worth staying for, she said, and walked out. The twist that nobody in Dry Creek saw coming arrived on a Friday 3 weeks after the auction. It arrived in the form of 2 men in clean city clothes and a formal letter bearing the seal of the San Antonio Northern Railroad Company, who rode up to the Hartwell gate and asked through Denny whether Miss Abigail Mercer was available to meet with their land acquisition representative, not Caleb Hartwell. Abigail Mercer. Denny came to find her at the dairy. His expression was the particular expression of a young man who has just witnessed something that has rearranged his understanding of how the world works. "They asked for you," he said. "By name." She dried her hands. "Who told them my name?" "They said Martha Bell." She told them that any negotiation regarding the Hartwell South pasture should go through you as the ranch's business manager. Abigail looked at him for a moment. Then she looked toward the house where she could see the 2 men waiting with their formal letter and their city shoes and their railroad company seal. She felt something move through her that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, but lived somewhere between the two, the feeling of a thing falling into its correct place after being held at the wrong angle for too long. "Tell Caleb," she said. "Tell him to come to the meeting. We do this together." She went to find her notebook. The railroad negotiation lasted 3 hours. The 2 representatives from the San Antonio Northern, a senior man named Colcott, and a younger associate who took notes, had clearly come expecting either a desperate landowner, willing to accept their first number, or a hostile one who needed to be managed. What they found was Abigail Mercer sitting across from them with 11 days of documented ranch financials, a clear understanding of the proposed rail corridor's value to their company, and a series of very specific questions about easement terms, compensation structure, and long-term operational access rights. Caleb sat beside her. He spoke when he had something to add. He let her lead when she was leading. He did not apologize for this arrangement or explain it, because a man who has genuinely learned something doesn't announce the lesson, he lives it. Colcott, by the second hour, had stopped trying to manage the conversation and had started simply responding to it. He was a professional, and professionals recognize competence across a table regardless of its packaging. The first number they put forward was 20% below what Abigail had calculated as fair value. She said no. They came up 10%. She showed them the competing interest calculation, what the easement was worth to the railroad over a 20-year operational period versus what it cost them in upfront land compensation, and waited while Colcott did the math on his own notepad and arrived at the same conclusion she'd already arrived at. He came up to full value. She asked for 5% above in exchange for a 10-year maintenance access agreement that would create ongoing income for the ranch beyond the initial easement payment. Colcott looked at his associate. His associate looked at his notes. Colcott looked at Abigail. "You've done this before," he said. "I've read enough contracts to know what fair looks like," she said. He agreed to the terms. When the representatives rode out with a signed preliminary agreement, Caleb sat at the kitchen table and looked at the figure written on the copy of the document, and then looked at Abigail and said quietly, "That's enough to clear the legitimate debt and restock the herd." "Yes," she said. "And the maintenance income. Covers Denny's wages and 2 additional hands for the next decade without touching cattle revenue," she said. He set the paper down. He looked at her with the full, undivided attention of a man who was seeing something clearly that he had been slowly understanding for weeks. "This ranch," he said, "what it's going to be, that's you." "That's both of us," she said. He shook his head. Not in disagreement, in the particular honest way of a man correcting himself toward truth. "No," he said. "I kept the land. You built the future. Both of those things are true, and I'm not going to pretend the second one is smaller than the first." She looked at him steadily. "Then we agree," she said. "And we build it together from here." "Together," he said. "Equal ground." "Equal ground," she said. The community supper came in late August, when the worst of the summer heat had begun its slow retreat and the valley had finished processing everything that Sunday had started. Martha Bell organized it. That was itself a statement Martha did not organize things unless she believed they mattered enough to be marked. She held it on the green behind the general store long tables and lantern light, and half of Dry Creek came because the other half told them to. Crow was not present. He was occupied with federal investigators and his own attorneys and the slow grinding machinery of accountability that moves without drama but does not stop once it starts. Garrett was there. Hitch was there with his wife, who had brought a pie and the expression of a woman who had been quietly furious for 2 years and was finally in the right room to let it show productively. Webb was there, looking thin and relieved in the way of a man who has put down something heavy and is only now realizing how long he'd been carrying it. Caleb stood at the head of the table when Martha called for a moment of acknowledgement, and he did not give a long speech because he was not a long speech man. He said 4 sentences. "I hired her because I thought I needed a wife," he said. "I was wrong. I needed someone brave enough to tell me the truth." He paused. "And then stay long enough to help me do something about it." The table was quiet in the way of people who have recognized something real. Then Abigail spoke. She had not planned to, but Martha looked at her with the expression of a woman who had decided she was going to speak, and Martha's expressions tended to be correct about these things. "Land doesn't come back because one person owns it," she said. "It comes back when people stop using pride as a fence." She looked at the table at Garrett and Hitch and Webb and Claude, and the man from the Dennison place whose name she'd learned was Rufus, and who had a legal claim now that the federal investigation had opened the question of Crow's other acquisitions. This valley lost things it shouldn't have lost, and getting them back is going to take longer than 1 summer and 1 auction and 1 good decision. But it starts with people choosing to look at what's actually in front of them instead of what they wish was there. She sat down. Martha Bell, who had seen 30 years of this valley and its people, and its capacity for both failure and recovery, raised her glass. Everyone followed. 1 year later, the sign at the gate read, "Hartwell Mercer Ranch." It had not been Caleb's idea. It had been Denny's, actually offered with the straightforward logic of a 19-year-old who had been present for all of it and could not understand why the sign would say anything else. Caleb had agreed immediately. Abigail had argued briefly that it wasn't necessary, and Caleb had said, "Equal ground," and she had stopped arguing. The dairy was running at 3 times its original capacity. The cattle herd was back to 40 head and climbing the bloodline records intact and properly managed the breeding program, the one Caleb's father had started, and Caleb had nearly lost, and Abigail had reconstructed from the old notes in the wooden box. The south pasture had rail access now clean properly, compensated with a maintenance agreement that paid a steady quarterly sum into the ranch accounts. The legitimate debt was nearly cleared. 18 months ahead of the schedule, Abigail had laid out at the kitchen table the day after the auction. The federal case against Crow was moving through its process, federal things being what they are but moving. Garrett had been awarded compensation for his lost lease. Hitch's note had been voided. The Dennison family was in conversation with their own attorney about recovery of the parcel Crow had acquired. The valley was not healed. Healing takes longer than a year and requires more than one good outcome. But it was moving in the right direction, which is the only direction that matters. Caleb and Abigail stood at the repaired barn in the last of the August evening, the summer that had tried to take everything finally releasing its grip. The cattle were in the south pasture. Denny was somewhere with the 2 new hands finishing the day's last tasks, with the cheerful competence of a young man who had discovered he was good at something that mattered. Caleb had the old ledger in his hands, the one that had once recorded ruin, and now recorded something entirely different. "Next quarter," he said, reading the numbers, "we're clear." "I know," she said. "You knew before I did." "I usually do," she said. He looked at her with the expression that had been developing for a year and had settled by now into something permanent and clear and unambiguous. The look of a man who had found the thing he intended to spend his life next to and had stopped being uncertain about it. "Marry me," he said. She turned to look at him. Not surprised she'd known this was coming, the way you know weather is coming by the quality of the air before it arrives. She had been thinking about her answer for 3 months. "Equal ground," she said. "Equal ground," he said without hesitation. your name on the deed, your authority in every decision. Your judgment counted the same as mine in writing and practice, in front of anyone who needs to know it." She held his gaze for a long moment. The evening settled around them. The cattle moved in the south pasture. The barn stood solid and repaired behind them. The sign at the gate said both their names. She looked at the ledger in his hands, the book that had traveled from ruin to evidence to proof to record of survival. And she thought about her father, who had taught her to read everything before signing. And she thought that if he could see her now, standing on ground, she'd helped reclaim from a man who'd tried to take it, he would recognize the daughter he'd raised. "Yes," she said. It was the only word required. She had always known the difference between the things that needed long explanations and the things that only needed the truth stated plainly. Caleb Hartwell put the ledger down right there at the barn door, and he took her hand, the way a man takes the hand of a person he intends to stand beside for the rest of his life. Not possessively, not dramatically, but with the simple certain grip of someone who has finally stopped being afraid of wanting something good. The Hartwell-Mercer Ranch did not become the jewel of the frontier because a cowboy saved it. It became the jewel of the frontier because a woman walked through its gate, refused to look away from what was wrong, and chose every single morning to stay and build something better from what the truth had left behind. That was the whole story, and it was enough.